This looks at the EU security agenda 1 year after the Brussels attacks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's a historic moment, of course, maybe a little bit much to say that, but we've got a new format after the changes in the rules of procedure. On these topical debates, the groups have agreed a speakers list, and they've also agreed that there'd be no catch the eye procedure, and that also there will be no blue cards accepted. We will thereby start with our colleague Madame Metsola for the EPP, and who had requested this debate. Madame Metsola for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was in a meeting in the European Parliament in colleague Alain Lamassour's office when the bombs went off in Brussels almost 1 year ago. Anyone who, like many of us here, think of Brussels as a home away from home will never forget the moments of panic, of anger, of helplessness and of grief for the victims of those attacks. But since the horrific events of last year, our shock has given way to a grim resolve to counter this terrorist threat and to address both the immediate danger of more attacks and the causes of radicalisation that plague our societies. Nothing is more important to our citizens than the basic right for them to feel safe, doing the things that they have always done and living the lives that they choose. Freedom and security are not simple buzzwords that look good on our Twitter feed or in press releases. They are the very core concepts that underpin our way of life, because without them, there can be nothing else. We must do everything we can to keep Europe safe. Colleagues, we can look to the citizens we represent, and we can be proud of the work we have done so far to boost the fight against terrorism. But it must continue. And that is why it is so important for the EPP that we are having this debate today. Keeping Europe safer is at the top of our agenda and will remain there. Now, in this Parliament, we have worked hard to speed up efforts on common EU rules on better information about passengers travelling from and to the EU with our PNR system. We have introduced systematic checks at our external borders. We have pushed forward strategies against radicalisation, against those who preach hate and incite terror. We have gone after the money and tackled terrorism financing. And crucially, we have moved forward towards better support for the victims of terrorism. Terrorism leaves so many hidden victims that its mark stains for generations. We have to give those people a voice, support to return to life, and we have to remember those that we have lost. We have done a lot, but there is much, much more that needs to be done if we are to continue to address people's security concerns in Europe. We will not cease in our efforts until we secure a Europe that is safer. Information sharing between member states must be improved, and we have to ensure that our law enforcement agencies have all the tools and the resources that they need to respond and to remain one step ahead of the terrorists and their networks. Our IT systems must be able to operate in tandem with each other, and we need to look at what law enforcement controls need improving. Prevention and persecution of criminal behaviour must be made more efficient by having a fully functional EU criminal record system in place. And at the same time, it is essential that we have a coordinated approach to stop the trafficking of illegal arms so often used by terrorists during terrorist attacks in Europe. We need to improve our use of biometric data. The loopholes that were exposed by the Berlin attacker, for example, who had 14 different identities, must be closed. Now, the EU is not alone in its fight, because terrorism is a global threat that requires a global response. Cooperation with third countries in listing and implementing anti-terror measures needs to remain on the EU's agenda, and I am convinced that we will get there. But it is true that apprehension remains. My children still get scared when they realise that we still need soldiers outside many public events. And it is true that every time we hear a police siren, a part of us goes back to that fateful day a year ago. But the people of Europe, Mr. President, will not cower. Our way of life will go on, despite the fear that we must all sometimes feel. And I'll conclude. When our continent came under attack, We did not shy away from the challenge. We identified where we need to do more, we stood up and we gave a European response. Our fear did not define us, determination did, and it will continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Metsola. And now, for the Council, Minister Borg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, honourable members. In a week's time, we will be commemorating the first anniversary of the Brussels attacks of the 22nd March, which are still so vivid in our memories. Let me start by saying that I agree with you that it is time to take stock of where we are, 1 year after these attacks, in terms of security, and I welcome this debate. We have made major progress in the last 2 years, but we continue to face unprecedented challenges. The European Day of Remembrance of Victims of Terrorism of the 11th March last Saturday was an important reminder of why it matters so much to continue our efforts. All citizens have the right to live free from fear, whatever their opinions or beliefs are. Putting in place measures to prevent and fight terrorism whilst maintaining an open and free society is a delicate balance. While stepping up our counter-terrorism tools, we should preserve our values and fundamental rights. Looking back at where we were before 2015, I think we can safely say that we have come a long way. Together, we have adopted a number of legislative instruments and other measures to prevent and fight terrorism. In 2016, together we successfully concluded the negotiations on the Directive on Combating Terrorism within a very tight time schedule, so that it could be signed today. One of the keys to ensuring security of our Union is better information exchange and better information management. We are therefore working hard to implement the 2016 Roadmap on Information Exchange and Information Management, containing 50 actions for improving information exchange. The high-level expert group on information systems and interoperability set up by the Commission last year is equally important. We are confident that these efforts contribute to enhancing trust amongst Member States and Europol, and to increasing information exchange. The figures are quite promising. For example, regarding Europol's databases, the content of the Europol information system increased by 34% between 2016 and 2017, and the number of data on foreign fighters increased by 11%. A record number of 1.4 million searches were performed in the Europol information system in 2016, an increase of 127%. The use of Siena messaging, which has been upgraded to the level EU confidential in 2016 and now better suits the needs of intelligence services, has also increased by 19%. As regards information sharing by the security services, Europol has created the possibility for counter-terrorism units to communicate bilaterally using the Secure Information Exchange Network. The European Counter-Terrorism Centre, operational since January last year, is more and more fulfilling its role as an information and cooperation hub in support of Member States. The Firearms Directive is another important achievement in the fight against terror. Yesterday, you approved the compromised text, and this will allow the Council to vote and successfully close the legislative procedure in first reading. The new directive will enhance the traceability of firearms. It will provide more stringent rules in terms of deactivation of firearms. This is particularly important since precisely poorly deactivated and reactivated firearms had been used in some of the recent terroristic attacks. And finally, the new directive also prohibits some dangerous semi-automatic firearms. Radicalisation is something which must obviously be addressed, primarily by Member States, but also by a coordinated and broad approach at EU level. We have started updating the set of guidelines agreed in December 2014 to complement the revised EU strategy for combating radicalisation and recruitment to terrorism, to bring it into line with the current developments. This complements the efforts undertaken by the Commission in relation to the recently launched network of national prevent coordinators. Focusing on online initiatives, the work of the Europol Internet Referral Unit at Europol is crucial. Cooperation with service providers has proven successful, and approximately 90% of the content considered illegal is taken down by service providers. At the EU Internet Forum ministerial meeting in December last year, the internet companies involved announced the creation of a new shared database to facilitate the identification of potential terrorist content on their platforms. Another important part of our joint endeavours concerns the rights of victims of terrorism, which have been significantly strengthened last week's adoption of the Directive on Combating Terrorism. This directive includes a catalogue of specific measures and services for the victims of terrorism. It also introduces a coordination mechanism in case of a terroristic attack. In relation to external borders, an additional safeguard will be provided as of next month, when the amendment to the Schengen Borders Code to reinforce checks against relevant databases at external borders in light of the increased terrorist threats will enter into force. Member States will have to carry out systematic checks on all persons, also those enjoying the right of free movement under EU law, when they cross the external border both at entry and exit, against databases, and in order to verify that those persons do not represent a threat to public order and internal security. Mr. Chair, honourable members, allow me to say a word on the external security and defence aspects. In the present international environment, Europe must do more to protect its citizens and contribute to peace and stability in its neighbourhood and beyond, including by committing sufficient additional resources. After the endorsement of the EU Global Strategy by the Council in December 2016, the European Council addressed this topic at its meeting last week. It welcomed the real progress made in a number of key areas. Building on that momentum, work will be taken further, and the European Council will revert to this issue in June to provide further strategic guidance. I use this opportunity to flag that last week the European Council reiterated the call it made last December for us as co-legislators to agree on the proposal for an entry and exit system by June this year, and we have also been called upon to speed up work on the proposal for the European Travel Information and Authorisation System. I hope that together we will be able to meet this call. Finally, I can assure you that we are continuously striving to improve, to close gaps and to enhance our security, including by assessing our structures and policy, which can contribute to ensuring the EU policies are fit for purpose. I thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Chair, and now I look forward to hear both commissioners and also the honourable members for this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Borg. And now for the Commission, now Mr. Avramopoulos will take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President. Honourable members of the Parliament, Minister Burg, today we are commemorating a tragic anniversary. Almost 1 year from the day terror struck Brussels, we are here, united, to pay our respect to the memory of the victims of terrorist attacks. We remember and honour those that died unnecessarily, innocent citizens. We remember and recognise the suffering of their families and the survivors of the attacks. They have to live forever with the memory of the atrocities. We all know that terrorism is a brutality, an act of inhumanity and callousness. That is why today is also a day of resolve, of resilience, of determination, to do everything in our power to prevent such terrorist attacks from happening again. This is a duty we all share here in this room, and it is ultimately our duty towards our citizens that increasingly look towards Europe to feel safe against terrorism. Almost 1 year ago, we said that the only way to fight terrorism decisively is together, through a genuine and effective security union in Europe, where the security of one member state is the security of all. Starting from our external borders, where we put in place a European Borders and Coast Guard, proposed an EU entry-exit system, and ETIAS, our travel information and authorisation system for visa-free travellers, ensuring systematic checks on everybody crossing our borders, working with our strategic partners like the United States of America, but also our neighbours, the Western Balkan countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Tunisia and Turkey. Improving the way we exchange information, interconnecting our information systems to make sure we connect all the dots. Establishing our European PNR system to track the movements of dangerous persons. Criminalising all aspects of terrorism with our new counter-terrorism directive. Strengthening our agencies, starting from Europol, where we set up our counter-terrorism centre to help member states in their operations. Cutting the access of terrorists to explosives and firearms. You actually voted on our new firearms directive this morning. Going after the money of terrorists with a series of proposals targeting money laundering, assets freezing, cash movements and suspicious financial flows from third countries. Strengthening the security of all models of transport, which are often the main target of terrorists. We do this through stepped-up intelligence sharing, local risk assessments, innovative methods and technologies, and the key role of operators for a successful implementation of measures. And finally, working to counter radicalisation in our communities, schools, prisons, and especially on the internet. Now that Daesh is losing all its territory on the ground, the internet is where they will focus. I have just returned from Silicon Valley, where I went to meet the major internet companies working with us in the EU Internet Forum, an initiative we took 2 years ago, as has proved itself very successful. What I confirm in this visit is that we managed to build a solid relationship of trust and partnership with these companies. Our goals are shared. They want to clean up their platforms from all terrorist content. We want to keep our citizens their users safe. Concrete results from this partnership are already visible. The referral mechanism we set up with Europol last year resulted in almost 90% removal rate of the content we refer to the companies. I have seen in action their new project to eliminate terrorist propaganda, a shared database between them to ensure removed terrorist content stays offline. I heard how they want to work with us to bring the smaller, more vulnerable platforms into our partnership. And it is not just about removing terrorist content. It is also about creating contact with positive narratives. Today, as I said, we launched the Civil Society Empowerment Programme with an amount of €10 million financial envelope attached to help NGOs pass positive counter messages online. Things are moving forward, but we still have a lot of work ahead. We have put important proposals on the table that you need to adopt swiftly to make a difference for the security of our citizens. Entry-exit, ETIAS, the Schengen Information System work should be completed this year. What we agree should be fully and correctly implemented. PNR, the Counter-Terrorism Directive, our new rules on firearms have entered the crucial stage of implementation, and as you understand, we cannot afford to fail. Tragic anniversaries, such as today's, underscore our responsibility to deliver without delay for the memory of the innocent victims, for the safety of our citizens, for our collective security. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Avramopoulos. Now, Mr. Roland for 1.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. In my country, the 22nd of March has become a symbol of mourning. A year ago, Brussels was hit by terrorist violence. People lost their families. There are people who are still suffering at work and at home in their lives on the 22nd of March. But we also remember all of those everywhere else in Europe and around the world. Now, security measures today are in place, but life has gone back to normal. Brussels will always remain Brussels. Beautiful Brussels, as the song goes. European Brussels. Brussels, the symbol of openness and diversity. Terrorists have meant that we have to protect ourselves better, but they have failed, and they will always fail when it comes to trying to impose their totalitarian views. The condition of being together is that we have to protect ourselves, and radicalism is something that we see. We have to act. It's very complex. We have to act in every single way, everywhere, in order to preserve our humanity. And on the radio, people have talked about the values of justice and tolerance, and that was one of the victims of these attacks. And that people have lost their families, but still have a message of hope and of strength. Building walls of exclusion, cultivating hatred gets us absolutely nowhere. If we want a different world, we have to stick to love and to tolerance. And I hope that those words will help us to find a way of reinforcing our security while at the same time preserving our liberty and our ability to live together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roland. Now it's Madame Fajon for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Honourable members, last years have not been easy for Europe. Several terrorist attacks have taken lives. What are the lessons we have learned from more than a decade of fight against terrorism? It is a mistake to say all terrorism is inspired by religion. Terrorist acts are first and foremost criminal acts. Terrorism is difficult to predict, especially when it goes for lone wolf terrorism cases such as Breivik in Norway. We have taken actions. The S&D Group has been a constructive partner in adopting key security measures, but some do not work properly or are not implemented. Let me first stress the most important thing. There can be no freedom without security. But security without respect of fundamental rights is unacceptable. In the S&D Group, today we call on the Commission and Member States for concrete actions. We need full analysis of all the measures currently in place on national and EU level. We need to know which are implemented and whether they are efficient, also why some are not working and what is still missing or can be improved. What is certainly missing is the lack of cooperation and information intelligence exchange between the countries. We need to better address and tackle the root causes of terrorism around the world. We have to do more on bridging Europe's social divide. De-radicalisation, social inclusion and education should be at the core of the counter-terrorism strategy. It is wrong to believe we do nothing. In the LIBE Committee, most of the legislation currently deals with security. But security means also human rights. And security means also less social inequalities in Europe. So, colleagues, stronger European action is required to successfully counter terrorism. The best weapon over fear and hatred in Europe is human dignity and security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Fajon. Now, 1.5 minutes, Madam Stevens.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, next week on Wednesday, it will be exactly 1 year when the heinous attack against the Belgian national airport of Zaventem and the metro station in Malbec in the European area was attacked, and many people were affected, and I would like to extend my condolences and support to the persons who were involved and who are still suffering. Now, in the upshot of this horror, we have voted on European legislation in order to avoid such acts into the future. The directives will allow us to have passenger data on persons flying in and out of the European Union, and we must continue with that. We must keep all of this in our sights. Then we have the Schengen Code. The European citizens and foreign citizens can be controlled through this, through our national airports. And also we should be able to catch the persons who are participating in jihadist camps in Syria. There are foreigners who want to visit the European Union, but there should be some type of prior control of these persons, such as is implemented in the United States. I hope that we can speak on these issues in a tranquil way, because this is of utmost importance to our citizens.
Thank you, Madam Stevens. Now, 2 minutes for Monsieur DEPREZ.
Merci, Président.
Thank you, President. Almost to the day, it is a year since we had the attacks in Brussels. 32 people died, 324 people were injured, 224 people in hospital. And this can just be added to the tally from Madrid, London, Paris, Nice, Berlin, and others. Hundreds of people have died and about 10,000 people injured in all. Europe has been terribly attacked by all of these, but we do have to do what we can to combat the terrorist threat. Commissioners and the Commissioner have given us an exhaustive list of what is being done, and I won't go over that again, but I do welcome the initiatives that have been taken and those that are still to be taken. But that isn't really what I wanted to speak about today. I wanted to dedicate the time that I have to the victims. Now, I read in the press that the last person in hospital at the Brussels attack only got home on the 15th of February this year, and you can imagine what kind of a state they're in. Union, and I wonder whether we have taken suffering and the need of the victims into account and whether the compensation is up to it. I know that member states are very touched by this, and I know that they did take some very good measures very quickly for these victims, and I know that ministers have said that in the new directive against terrorist attacks there will be, under Article 24, a provision for member states to provide assistance to victims. But what about European solidarity? Where is that? We all know that terrorist attacks are a criminal attack, criminal aggression against everyone, and every single attack in any country is an attack against everybody else and all Europeans. But my question is the same. We have created a provision of solidarity fund to show our solidarity to the victims when there are natural disasters, and we have solidarity when there are natural disasters, but we don't seem to have that solidarity faced with these acts of aggression against us all. We help people in some ways, but not for those families that have had people killed. So that really, shame on us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. DEPREZ. Now for 1.5 minutes, Madam Ernst. It's good that we're having this debate today, and we are to blame that we haven't yet taken fully into account the people and their sadness, so our deepest sense of compassion. But what more than compassion? I think that the people affected want to have really is not an explanation of the attack. They want a question, is how can we stop this happening in the future? They know that there's no such thing as absolute safety and security. But when you look at the long catalogue of the Commission activities, then you wonder, is everything being done in terms of security? It is wrong to think that the more things you do, the better it is. You just put them all into the same saucepan. When people say the importance of data, well, you know that there's 34% more data coming into Europol. But the data was available, in fact, to the police. Whether the data bank is bigger or not makes no difference. You have to use it. And you need important and key information, I think, in order to stop the next attack. It's not just about the amount of data. What we need is the scientific exchange between the key authorities. What kind of data do we need? What information is necessary and relevant? What kind of activities need to take place at the border? And the important thing here is to ensure that we have security for our citizens. If we don't have a proper exchange of data, our citizens will not be safer. Thank you very much, Madam Ernst. Now, Mr. Lambert.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. First of all, I would like to express our solidarity with all of the victims of the attack of 22 March in Brussels and to their families. These acts should never have happened, and this suffering never should have occurred. But given the facts, what should we do? The priority in Europe is to have a technological surveillance of society as a whole. Persons have never been able to establish how this general surveillance, which has been long-standing in Anglo-Saxon countries, have prevented any attacks. At the same time, in Belgium and France, we're going to criminalize not just acts, but also intentions. And this seems to create a twofold democratic problem. You have a separation of the laws. The European state laws allow the police to have powers without any controls from the judiciary. So you don't have this executive judiciary control. Secondly, there's the issue of proportionality. Any restriction of liberty should be proportionate to the objective that we're aiming for. What is the reasonable aim of having all citizens be suspects? I think that our priorities should be simple. We know how the attacks were going to take place. We should share the information among the services, and we know that sharing information is the weak link, and we need to exploit the information, and we need human resources to do that. We are reducing police forces, and they're completely exhausted.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. Now for 2 minutes, Mr. Batten.
The Brussels terrorist attack in March 2016 saw 32 people dead and over 300 wounded. It was just one in a very long list of tragic and pointless acts of violence by religiously motivated fanatics. They carry out their senseless violence in the name of Allah and Islam. More accurately, they act in the name of Mohammedanism, the cult of Mohammed, which has always fed on blood for the 1400 years of his existence. And Mohammedans kill their fellow Muslims just as much, if not more, than they kill non-Muslims. If you want to address the problem, you first have to understand and confront its fundamental cause. A minority of Mohammedans take literally some passages in the Quran. They read the bits that say, make war on infidels, strike terror into the hearts of infidels, and kill infidels wherever you find them, and they act accordingly. They take literally the passage in the Hadith that says, Judgment Day will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews. It is true that most Muslims are law-abiding, decent people, but all Muslims are followers of the cult of Mohammed. That cult is an ideology of blood-soaked, regressive nonsense. Only a tiny minority of Muslims are fundamentalists and fanatics and literalists, but it only takes a tiny minority to plunge our societies into endless terror. All Muslims are not fundamentalists and terrorists, but the more Muslims you have in a population, the more Islam you will get. And the more Islam you have, the more terrorism you will get. Our arrogant and illiberal political elites of Western countries have created the problem by their open-door immigration policies and the doctrine of multiculturalism. I very much look forward to hearing how the EU is going to solve that problem and address the fundamental issue, but somehow I doubt that you will.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batten. And now Mr. Annemans for 2 minutes. Colleagues, a year after the attacks around my city of Brussels, we can see that the situation has not been stopped. It won't stop on its own. Yes, we try to understand, we try to negotiate and work. Yes, we all have got to get together and be solidarity amongst ourselves. All together, that's what we see written on the wall downstairs in front of the Malbec metro, 200 metres from the European Parliament. But this wasn't a natural catastrophe that took place. What happened is that we were attacked by fellow human beings. It could have been avoided and should have been avoided. All of the attacks in Europe have taken place in countries that have got significant Muslim communities in their societies. There's a kind of fatality, therefore, in the issue of terrorism. We have to ask ourselves the question, is there a link between immigration and terror? And is this an unavoidable connection? Let's hope it's not. We think of this in Brussels, where we have free-ranging criminality now in Brussels since the opening of the European borders. These are things that, we should have been proud of our open borders, but actually what it did is it led to more terrorism in our country. We can't therefore be proud of it. Because of a growing group of Muslims, this is seen as being an unavoidable result of that. What we call terrorism actually comes out of a deep unhappiness that they feel with the culture on our territories. We have to act. This naive form of mass immigration, this movement of peoples, has to stop. We have to manage our societies and our countries in a way that makes sense to all of us. We cannot adapt our societies to them. We have to make it absolutely clear, are you going to respect and adapt yourself to our values? This is absolutely urgent. Otherwise, what happened last March is terrorism, and terrorism doesn't stop on its own. Thank you very much, Mr. Annemans. And now, 1 minute, Mr. Epitideeios.
Thank you very much, President. It is almost a year now since the terrorist attacks happened in Brussels, and since that moment a lot has changed. Security measures have been improved considerably, both in quality and quantity, and people have learnt to live under this threat. and people accept as necessary the presence of soldiers and police on the streets. In spite of the harmful effect on daily life and on the economy because of these terrorist attacks, people in Brussels feel safe. And yet, the risk of a new terrorist attack has lessened somewhat, but we have not removed it completely, and this risk comes primarily from isolated people, individuals, who are not necessarily suspects to begin with, so they have the right of initiative, they have the ability to attack on the surprise. If we want to stop imported terrorism, if we want to stop people coming in, we have to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epitideios. Colleagues, I've allowed people to talk a little bit over their times, but we're a little bit behind, 60% behind time at the minute. We have to get back on time. So now it's Mr. Proust for 1.5 minutes.
President, colleagues, if there is a public action in the European Union and if there is any raison d'etre for policy, it would be in the area of security. We saw Paris, Brussels, Nice, Berlin. Every time there's an attack, Europe as a whole is attacked. And these barbaric and brutal terrorists use terror and horror to attack our values. The Islamists, there are many terrorists hiding there, and we must have a clear response to that. And we must have a border guard and coastal guard which is strengthened, and a PNR system for exchange of passenger information. But Ms. Le Pen was against these arrangements because she saw them as being liberalist, and the citizens will then have to suffer that inconsistency. Measures have been stepped up, but we have to work together. Rachid Dati, in her report on radicalization leading to terrorism, said that we need to take precise action to combat this plague. European states have to come together for in external actions. We must have an alliance of defense because all member states need to make an effort on the ground. The European Commission has the responsibility of creating an impetus for cooperation in the European Union, and it's by bringing our forces together that we can effectively protect our citizens and our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Proust. And now it's Madam Gomez for 1.5 minutes.
Solidarity with victims after the attacks in Brussels is important, is absolutely critical. But there are criticisms of the government here in Brussels and Belgium and others who are denying the reality. What happened in Paris ought to have meant that we had more sharing of information and intelligence. We now have PNR, but this directive does not make private flights or the exchange of intelligence obligatory. And we have European governments who are saying, indeed, that terrorism comes from the outside, and we have external fighters, foreign fighters coming in, and their attitude is a dangerous one. Terrorists who attacked in Brussels, Paris and elsewhere were Europeans. So we have to invest in anti-radicalization programs and others. We have to make sure that there are legal ways for introducing, for bringing in legal refugees, and we have to put an end to the financing of certain networks, and we've got to have the right measures in place. Where are these measures? There are other programs that allow citizens who have money to have resident permits, which allows money laundering. So we have to look at what happened in Libya. We've got to be consistent.
Thank you very much. Now, Corey Dalton.
Well, the attacks in Brussels touch many of us in this institution, and the subsequent attacks in France and Germany have shown that the threats we face today from terrorism are as grave as ever. Terrorists have shown that they are willing to attack indiscriminately and across Europe. We only tend to notice when terrorists succeed in carrying out their atrocities, but every day our security forces are preventing other attacks from taking place across the continent. Terrorists don't recognise borders, and with the free movement in the Schengen zone making cross-border terror attacks easier, our strongest tool remains cooperation and information sharing. We have made progress. In fact, we've come a long way on improving databases and sharing information, but more needs to be done. The data we share is only as good as the data we put in it. So it needs every country in Europe to fully commit to sharing valuable information in our common interests. We also need to ensure measures such as PNR are properly implemented without delay. Our external borders also need continuing reinforcement. Europe should not be a soft target for terrorists to just wander in. But our biggest challenge and focus remains stopping homegrown terrorism, stopping young Europeans from turning against their own society. And a lot of good work has already been done on prevention of radicalisation, on our streets, in our prisons, in our schools, and most importantly, in our sports fields. But there's a lot more to be done. Learning from each other and sharing best practice is key. There is no single thing we can do to stop terrorism. This fight will be with us for a generation. But by sharing information, updating our databases and addressing radicalisation, we can make it harder for the terrorists to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dalton. Now for 1.5 minutes, it's a colored Paga Fautun Dua Ruiz.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Every victim, every family calls for justice and support, and we have to move forward in that. We're not doing so at the moment. Society asks us for efficiency against terrorism. We have managed to avoid attacks. The agenda for security has moved forward, and we managed to come together, get rid of some of our differences to find some agreement in some important areas such as PNR and the Counter-Terrorism Directive. Terrorism by suicide bombers is very difficult to fight, but they didn't manage to do all the damage that they wanted to in 2016. Nevertheless, 133 people were killed in the EU and 31 Europeans were murdered outside of the EU. These deaths, this is being used as an instrument for propaganda and has created this sense of fear across the world. We have improved the normative framework and the operations are ever more efficient, but still we're too reactive, not proactive enough. And we have to look ahead of ourselves. We have to ensure we use all of the intelligence that comes to us from all the possible areas in order to be firm in our approach. That's what we're asking for. We want to have obligatory exchange of information. We want to have European intelligence in advance, and we have to work against violent radicalisation. It doesn't matter how efficient it is in terms of arresting terrorists. If the legitimization of violence is getting more rooted amongst young people, then we're going to find ourselves in a very dangerous phase. We're not moving forward on the fight against violent radicalization at the same speed as against the operative agenda. We need to have a more strong and a more integrated Europe. That's absolutely essential. We are going to be better the more that we work together in order to defend our freedoms. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Paga Fautun Dua Ruiz. And now for 1 minute, our colleague, Malin BJÖRK.
Commission, Council, I was in the Brussels airport the day of the attack. I was in the arrivals halls, waiting to go out through customs, when we heard and felt the first explosion, and then the second explosion, and some of us thought that the roof was coming down upon us. Others didn't dare to run for the exit because they thought people would stand there and shoot. And my body remembers that fear. And it is in that feeling that I refuse those that say that we have to learn to live with this. Terrorism is man-made and we can undo it. But it's also here that I get politically angry because I see a one-sided focus on militarized security, on surveillance technology, and I think it's short-sighted and it's inefficient. It won't stop the Breiviks mentioned here earlier or the Abdesalam of this Europe. We need to shift focus. We need to create inclusive societies, more equal, we need to speak about gender equality, we need to counteract racism, xenophobia and Islamophobia. And no rifles or surveillance technology in the world can do that. I would just finish by saying I think we need to change the institutional setup. We need to call together ministers, employment.
Thank you very much, Madam Björk. And now for 1 minute, Madam Joly.
Monsieur le Président.
President, it is a year since Brussels was hit by horror, and after homage was paid, we were told that action would be taken, but very little has been done to fill the gap that was revealed by those attacks, in particular the gaps in the exchange of relevant information between our countries. Most member states still against having mandatory automatic exchange of intelligence, which is indispensable. We had been promised action, but member states simply reacted and made political gestures, and were quite happy to play the card of fear to ensure that they could get very intrusive surveillance laws passed. And those are the words of the UN Special Rapporteur on Privacy, who has just drawn up a report on the ineffectiveness of surveillance laws in recent years. Now, the real lessons have not yet been drawn. How much time, how much abuse, how many dramas do we have to have before those lessons are finally learned? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Joly. Now, for 1 minute 30, Mr. Paksas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 1 year after Brussels attacks, less than 1 year and a half since the last terror attacks in Paris, 1 year since attacks in Nizza. We can also remember earlier attacks in Madrid, Paris and Brussels. We can count all the victims of terror attacks all over Europe. But could we answer anything to the families of those victims if they asked what specific had you done so that these terror attacks would be prevented in the future? We have adopted innumerable legal acts, but what do you think, on the basis of which of these documents people deciding to carry another attacks would base their actions on these acts if they decide to carry out another attack? Maybe some of these hundreds of persons who are enumerated as potential terrorists feared of those documents and left Europe. Well, I doubt that. They have not entered Europe in order to leave it. We can also doubt the fact that those persons who have entered Europe via those Mediterranean states would leave it in the doves of peace. Europe has not become safer than earlier. We shouldn't believe that terrorists became weaker, because this is not a very reasonable policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paksas. Now for 1 minute, our colleague ZIJLSTRA.
Yes, thank you very much, President. In this seat, Hans Janssen sat, world-renowned through his book, Intergalactic Duty, looking at the Islamic Brotherhood as the foundation of fundamentalism, and talking about the death of religions in the world. But jihad is not the duty of jihadists only. It's of all Muslim practitioners, and this is really what we see in the attacks on our society. There are people who feel that we should encourage and support Muslim persons, but if we do that, we will never be safe again, and there is no EU security agenda that could help us combat us if that were to happen.
Thank you, Mr. ZIJLSTRA. Now Mr. Voigt, 1 minute. Yes, thank you, Chair. The microphone, Mr. Voigt, your microphone isn't on. Mr. Voigt.
Ihr Mikro ist nicht an.
Your microphone wasn't on. Okay, it's going now. Thank you, Chair. Yes, Europe is a bit like a Swiss cheese on the outside borders, is it not? And I think that's where the real problem is. Quite simply, if all of the countries on the eastern borders had secure borders, then there wouldn't be so many terrorists coming in. And the arms wouldn't be coming in as well. We yesterday looked at and agreed a new arms directive, but none of this will have real effect, I don't think, because there's going to be, we protected collectors, museums and hunters, but none of the weapons that were used for the attacks came from these particular groups. Nothing has been decided as yet, for example, to deal with all of the arms weapons that exist. For example, in Bosnia, hundreds of thousands of weapons are currently in circulation. Nothing has been done to actually limit the circulation of these war weapons, and nothing has been done in order to stop these weapons coming into Europe. Thank you very much, Mr. Voigt. Now, 1.5 minutes, Mr. Díaz de Mera García Consuegra.
Yo con las víctimas, señor.
I stand with the victims, Mr. President. Managing the security of over 500 million people is a very complicated but necessary task. The threats against the unions, terror, organised crime, cybercrime, need a committed response from the member states with coordination and cooperation. Madrid, London, Copenhagen, Brussels, Nice, Berlin are painful episodes for all Europeans, and they show the path of terrorism, indiscriminate terrorism, and the communication from the Commission are the tools that we have to try to respond to this threat. And there are results, but they're never enough. Terrorism confiscates and kidnaps, it kills, but we do fight against this with law and guarantees, and the disproportion between the attacks and the response to that is so exaggerated, that it's so great that we will never be able to ensure total security. We have to do more. We have to make sure with national security, and we have to move from national security to the collective security of the Union. We have to cooperate more and better in police cooperation, intelligence, better police our external borders as well, make sure that our prisons and elsewhere work together, that we've got to make sure there is better interoperability of information systems. We have to better police arms and other trafficking. All of these are necessary tools to improve security in Europe, and we have to have better visibility, better protection for all our victims. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for Mr. Díaz de Mera. Now 1.5 minutes, Mr. Fleckenstein. Chair, our colleague Rolin said quite properly that this is about ensuring that we live in the future with tolerance and love. But for that, we need freedom and security. And we can't allow it to be played off against each other. People have a right to both of them. And we therefore have an obligation to ensure that we give the possibility for both. The Social Democrats want to ensure that the Libe Committee and the AFET Committee work together to draw up a report that will look exactly at this. We've already decided on this. What works in the meantime? Where do we have to work on the implementation? Where do we have to provide more guidelines? And where do we have to undertake additional activities in order to ensure that freedom and security can be guaranteed, both inside and outside? And when it comes to the issue of the origins, it's extremely important we also look at the impacts. We've talked enough. We've decided a great deal. And now we've got to work together to see how we can actually speed up our activities in terms of implementation and ensure that the implementation works. And also find out what doesn't work. This isn't about one or the other. Now, though, not about that we're saying that it's essentially just about protection or prevention. We have a common responsibility for both activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Fleckenstein. And now, Mr. Jurek, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. 1 year ago, on the tragic day, many of us had a feeling that a war has started. And actually we were right, because there is a war going on in Europe. That was not one isolated incident. In order to provide safety and security for our citizens, they must have information, they must know what is going on. But unfortunately, that information is very often very superficial. What is radicalization? This is a step further from intention on the part of a radical jihadist to action. We really have to react very early. People who are not our citizens, when they gather to manifest hate, this action should be for us the reason to act. Everyone who supports those hate speech, those hate actions, cannot be tolerated. You have to isolate these people, and our society must be able to live in peace.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jurek. Mrs. VAUTMANS, for 1 minute.
Voorzitter, commissaris, meneer de minister, collega's.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. Now, about a year ago, Brussels was affected at its very heart. In the capital of Europe, 35 people were killed. 343 people were injured. And today, I'd like to pay tribute to those victims, because today, President, the latest victim was able to leave the hospital without getting any compensation. So I support the proposal of Mr. DEPREZ, who launched an appeal for the creation of a solidarity fund for the victims of terrorism in Europe. Secondly, Europe has to be strong together. Now, of course, the populists say that, oh, it's better to turn back onto ourselves. But it's better to protect our external borders and attack financing of terrorism, fight against radicalization together. Let's be strong. And what we do together, we do better.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. VAUTMANS. Mr. Couso-Permuy, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. First of all, a recollection of the murdered and condolences to their families. There were contradictions when the family was dealt with. These are Europeans, these terrorists. They're in ghettos, yes, they've been trained in Syria, they're known to the secret services. There's always a need to coordinate information among the secret services. They've trained in Syria like 5,000 Europeans who are fighting there today. So we have to speak openly on anti-terrorism with the Syrian government, as our secret services already do secretly. We need to give up supporting certain allegedly moderate groups which are actually terrorists. We need to pressure our allies so that, for example, the border with Turkey is not permeable. We need to stop Wahhabi radicalization, and we need above all an economic and cultural plan for our ghettos, which are so precarious and poor.
Thank you very much indeed. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Albrecht.
1 year after the Brussels attacks, it's the right moment to discuss the EU's security agenda. It's the moment to step back for a moment, to just pause and think through the implications of our actions until now. Are we taking the right measures to invest massively into better equipment and better cooperation of our police and security services, and into effective de-radicalization, or are we still putting forward expensive but ineffective and symbolic measures of mass data collection or intrusive surveillance measures against completely innocent citizens, and thereby weakening effective security and our freedoms together, which we defend? And therefore I'm very happy that Commissioner King is starting to investigate into the effectiveness of the hundreds of security measures which the European Union and its member states has adopted throughout the years. We have to see what's working and what's not working. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albrecht. And now Mrs. von Storch for 1 minute. Thank you, President. We will not forget the day of the Islamic terror attack in Brussels. And more than 300 were seriously injured, and we will be mourning those who died. But I don't believe the EU has learnt the right lessons. At least 3 of the attackers were born in Belgium, and they had Belgian citizenship. They became radicalized in Belgium. They established a terrorist cell in order to attack the country in which they grew up, to kill the people who were their neighbours. The attackers were to an extent integrated in Belgium, in their own parallel society. They were not integrated into the mainstream Belgian culture. Multiculti has failed. We have to understand our underlying culture in Europe, and we have to defend that. We want less multicultural, and we want more Christian-based understanding for our own culture. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. von Storch. And now for 1 minute, Mrs. Bizzotto.
Thank you, President. Europe hasn't done anything against Islamic terrorism, not after the Brussels attacks or the Nice or the Munich ones. We've been saying for years the enemy is inside the house. And unfortunately this enemy is called Islamic fundamentalism. Islam has declared war on us, and in war you have a duty to defend, to fight, to defend your children and your land. And we need to keep out the false refugees who are invading Italy and Europe. We've always denounced these things, and now facts confirm them. There are people who are hiding, the hidden terrorists arriving, looking like refugees. The terrorists can move freely from one country to another despite Schengen and hit our citizens. So let's stop this playing around. Let's close the borders. Stop the illegal immigrants, zero tolerance. That's the way really to fight the danger of Islamic terrorism.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Bizzotto. Mr. Albrecht, is this a point of order? President, I would like to have the comments of our colleague checked in the Bureau. I think it's unacceptable that migrants are accused of being criminals and terrorists. It's unacceptable to hear this type of thing in this hemicycle. We'll look into that. Mrs. Hohlmeier for 1.5 minutes.
Frau Kollegin Hohlmeier, darf ich Sie noch einen Moment bitten?
Mrs. Hohlmeier, could you just wait a moment, please? Mrs. Bizzotto, point of order.
No, semplicemente è Europol.
It's Europol who says that among the false refugees arriving in Europe there are terrorists. It's not me. Maybe you ought to read this report. It's a very clear one.
As I said, we will investigate, but we're not going to continue this dialogue now. Mrs. Hohlmeier for 1.5 minutes. Commissioner, President, Presidency of the Council, Minister, I will be delighted if the ENF could just stop saying the same things about everyone. Not all refugees are terrorists, not all terrorists are refugees. And I think life would be easier in this Parliament if we were a bit clear about that. More specifically, first and foremost, I would like to compliment Member States, because increasingly I believe we are learning to better exchange information, better to cooperate, and step by step basically break down certain national barriers which we were proudly standing up for beforehand, and we're moving towards more cooperation. And I think we need to further work upon that and improve it. We can't sit back on our laurels. just because there are no attacks right now, we shouldn't let down our guard. We have to keep up our efforts. And also, we've heard the Greens talking about a total supervisory state. That's not what exists. All the instruments we have are applied in a very balanced way. If they were not, if they were used against the rule of law, then we would have to do something. But if you lump everything into one thing and talk about Big Brother when you're trying to establish security, I think that's wrong. And at the end of my brief speech on behalf of Teresa Jiménez Becerril, I would call on the Member States more quickly to help the victims of terrorism than has been the case thus far. Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Hohlmeier. For 2 minutes, Mr. Weidenholzer.
Mr. President, attacks like the one last year in Brussels bring fear into the political climate and change the borders of the political debate. And in that sense, the terrorists will probably feel justified. So we have to be reasonable in our reactions. We've changed the border arrangements. We've improved conditions for Europol. Yesterday we passed the weapons directive. We need an effective exchange of information always, and we still need more active measures. We need to pay attention to the de-radicalization measures, and we need those in prisons, on the internet, and in the regions of origin. And if we look at this in the longer term, then we have to attack the problem at its root. It'll be a long and difficult struggle, and there will be new challenges all the time. Just now, if you look at the situation in Mosul, you'll see that confirmed. We all need to recognize that Daesh fighters we need to make sure that they cannot get into Europe. But this has been happening more and more, rather than being compensation for recruitment through proxy wars in Europe. We need to act faster and more efficiently, but we above all shouldn't look at the other way. If we do that, we'll be not paying our debt to the victims of Brussels.
Thank you, Mr. Weidenholzer. Mrs. McAvey, for 1 minute.
34 de vieți pierdute și 200 de răni.
Well, 34 lives lost and hundreds of injured a year ago in Brussels, and among those who were guilty, and there were citizens of Europe who chose to be as is now. Nobody can replace a life that's been lost, and time doesn't pardon either. And what have we done in the meantime? We've adopted an anti-terrorist directive to protect the victims, and that has to do with how to deal with common crimes that have to do with terrorism. We've adopted a regulation where we've amended the Schengen regulation for external borders and other laws as well. And there is more cooperation between the member states, that's true, and more exchange of data. But we are responsible. We and the member states are those who are guilty if there are more lives lost, because these measures have to be put into practice immediately. The databases have to function, we have to exchange data, and we have to have that in the hands of who needs them.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Boni for 1.5 minutes.
We need to remember about all victims of the terrorist attacks, and we have to counteract. The key dimension of the security strategy is prevention. We can prevent only working together and exchanging information on time. For this, the will from the member states and the law enforcement officers is crucial. The will to share information on demand, but also on their own initiative, information that might be needed somewhere else. It requires the technological common capacity and interoperability, not fragmentation related to the different countries' systems. The model of obligatory sharing information among law enforcement in the real time with coordination at the European level is necessary. More sharing of data is useful. Maybe we should think of the one holistic framework that would allow to share information more efficiently and much faster. The new architecture of the data exchange systems is necessary. It is key to find financial sources, European and national, for this purpose. We don't need to collect more data, but to make sure that the data are used more efficiently, that the police officer in the field will get the information when it is necessary and will be able to use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Boni. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. López Aguilar.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, President, Commissioner for Security Issues. We all fully remember exactly where we were a year ago, when in the airport and the metro in Brussels those bombs exploded. And since then we've felt this ongoing pain and the feeling of the need for solidarity with the victims and their families. I just want to say that the responses since then have moved in the right direction, but they weren't far enough. Well, the first response was in the wrong direction, allowing free circulation of people and suspending Schengen as well, because those terrorists who struck us so hard didn't come from outside. And still, we haven't gone far enough in having this specialized protection for the victims of terrorists. And interoperability in the available information is not enough either. With the Schengen information system is not enough to establish a genuine information and intelligence community in Europe. Prevention of radicalization doesn't go far enough either against jihadism in the networks and in the prisons, and also the question of identifying the sources of funding. We have to strengthen the money laundering directive as well to dry up the sources of terrorist funding and the arms available to the terrorists, certainly not legally held in the EU. But also we have to come back to fighting against disequality and exclusion, because that is one of the deep lying roots of terrorism. And that's what's upset people so much. This is a result of the austerity. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. López Aguilar. For 1 minute, Mr. Vistisen.
Now, it's a year ago since we had these terrible attacks in Brussels. But, of course, they weren't alone. Unfortunately, in recent years, we've seen a whole series of attacks, both here in Europe and other places as well, from radicalized Muslims who've attacked the values that our societies, our free societies, based on. And that's therefore regrettable that the EU, and especially the Parliament, has been an obstacle rather than a facilitator to implement effective cooperation concerning various anti-terrorist initiatives. It was a shame that it took so long to get the PNR proposal through the Parliament. And it isn't good enough that we haven't been able to protect our external borders also today. And so it's regrettable that the Commission and the Parliament have said no thank you to Denmark's offer to participate in both the PNR register and in the cross-border cooperation. If we mean it with anti-terrorism, we have to say yes when people come along and say they want to cooperate, not say no thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Vistisen. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. LENAERS.
Dank u, voorzitter. Het is bijna een jaar geleden dat we
Well, just about a year ago, we were all terrified by the horrors of the attacks in Brussels, and those images will remain in our minds forever. And I'm thinking of the families and the friends of the victims, as well as the victims. And a lot of things have taken place over the last 12 months. There's the PNR directive, there's anti-terrorist directive, there was controls of external borders that were strengthened, as the Commissioner said. But it's not just a question of adopting directives. We have to make certain as well that these directives do add added value in practice, and I am a bit worried about the rate at which they're being adopted or implemented. In some member states, the PNR hasn't been implemented yet, and we can't adopt legislation and then just leave it. The member states have to be active to implement things. Then we talk about external borders, but we also have to talk about internal borders. In my province, in Limburg, in the Netherlands, we have more borders with Belgium and Germany than with the rest of the Netherlands. So they have to be open, but we have to avoid being naive. There are terrorists, human traffickers, who know how to use these borders. And we have to find the way that these European borders, through cameras, scanners, whatever, are controlled in some way or another. And I'd like to have your opinion, Mr. Commissioner, about the possibilities of having these internal border controls thanks to these kinds of technologies.
Thank you, Mr. LENAERS. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Péter NIEDERMÜLLER.
Amikor a párizsi, brüsszeli vagy berlini merényletekre gondolunk, akkor mindenek
Mr. President, in Paris, in Berlin and Brussels, the attacks took place, and we think of the victims of this senseless fight. We need to understand that terrorism can not be fought with new laws or new committees. We need to think in an innovative way and choose a single different approach. The immigrants into Europe who are already here are turning against the European model and ideals and are being radicalized, and we need to answer the question how 70 years after the Second World War there can still be neo-Nazi groups flourishing in Europe, and we need to work out why young people from the working class should become supporters of terrorism. We need a common European program which will ensure that society shows a way to people, and when we want to stop radicalization or prevent it, and we want to prevent further such attacks, then we have to build the right kind of network with which we can win back people who are on the periphery of society and can be radicalized. And that way we won't have to talk in the future about the terrorism.
Next week will mark the first anniversary of the Brussels terrorist bombings. 32 innocent civilians were killed. On the streets of Brussels and around the Parliament, we are all too familiar now with the army's presence and regular patrols of the police that followed those attacks. It's a reminder to us all in Europe of the challenges that our societies face as we seek to prevent radicalization of our young people. Of the 5 terrorists, 4 were Belgians and a 5th was a Swede. These attacks illustrate the importance of intelligence sharing mechanisms to fight cross-border crime and terrorism that developed within the EU. Whether this is the passenger name records, the Prüm Convention, ECRI, the EAW or the Schengen Information System, these are all vital to providing security and protecting our citizens. As my country seeks to leave the European Union, I believe it is of utmost importance that the UK stays as plugged in as possible to all of these programmes, and that security cannot be a bargaining chip, but instead be settled as a top priority early on in the Brexit negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tannock. Mr. Coelho, for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President in Office, Commissioner King. A year ago, barbarism took Brussels, and then it happened in Nice and Berlin. Nothing justifies terrorism. What we have to do is prevent it and reduce the suffering of victims while attacking the criminals. We always have to join freedom of movement with security for our citizens. These are 2 fundamental freedoms which we have the duty to protect. Last year we reacted in haste. There were advances and there were steps backwards in member states, but some important steps. We strengthened Europol, we guaranteed victims' rights, We stepped up checks at external borders. We attacked radicalism, but as Roberta METSOLA says, we can always do better and do more. We've got instruments already on the ground which we can use, and we can adopt new measures as well. The Schengen Information System is paradigmatic. It's the one most used by the police, but most of its potential is still to be used. Well, above all, we need to get more information to the competent authorities, and that's my message this afternoon. In fighting terrorism, it's essential to have mutual confidence, to have more cooperation, to have better information. That is what we must focus on in our work now.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Mr. Picula for 1.5 minutes.
Terrorist attacks in Brussels left serious security, political and psychological consequences. Last year's attacks did not only lead to mass killings and destruction, but also sent a political message, because Brussels is the capital of the EU and it houses NATO headquarters. It also revealed Brussels to be a soft spot in the sense of security in Europe. Attacks, unfortunately, did not stop there, but were repeated in Nice and Berlin. Almost daily we read about attacks that were prevented in the last minute. Terrorism in Europe is still active, and we cannot afford to ignore this. We are facing not only a security crisis, but also challenges related to military security and social policy. We must finally tackle the worsened security situation within and outside our borders. Above all, by helping member states to efficiently cooperate and exchange information, but also by stabilizing potential political conflicts in our neighborhood. Circumstances today make greater cooperation in defense indispensable. Security and defense must not remain the weakest links in European integration, because if we fail in providing security for our citizens, we will drift even further from the European project. 1 year ago, Brussels was a city in lockdown. Since then, a dilemma has seeped in, whether the EU will keep openness as one of its core values, or will it gradually shift towards the fortress of Europe? I fear many politicians in Europe today would provide a rash answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Nicholson for 1 minute.
Thank you very much indeed, President. It's hard to believe, I suppose, that 1 year on from that terrorist attack almost in Brussels that morning, when it came to, I suppose, to the heart of Europe. These attacks were carried out at a time of the day when they were designed to cause maximum harm, damage and mayhem. And the thing that we have to always consider on occasions like this is to think that the families and the victims and those who have survived are probably going through as they relive that memory. I certainly welcome what the Commission are going to do on money laundering, on drugs and areas like that, because this is, to a large extent, is what's used by many terrorists to actually fund their programmes. And certainly violence and terror can never be justified nor used as an argument to achieve anything. And I always am a great believer, and I listen to a lot of comments, but I would leave you with one thought, and that is that the victims are more important than the victim makers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nicholson. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. PREDA.
Thank you, President. First of all, I'd like to welcome the progress that we've accomplished in the last year in terms of security and combating terrorism. We've advanced on essential questions like harmonization of European legislation, strengthening controls at external borders, exchanging information, or fighting against terrorist propaganda. Of course, there's still a long way to go. The directive on terrorism that we adopted last month is an important step forward, because we're creating a legal framework, a common legal framework, but above all, a common culture. Establishing confidence between our different intelligence services will not be achieved overnight, but the idea that a European combat represents a real added value is winning ground. In this respect, I'd like to support the establishment of a parliamentary committee on terrorism because it would be a platform for dialogue which would be extremely useful. Our practices are not always similar, but our objective is the same, the protection of European citizens against the danger of terrorism. The absolute priority is interoperability of data files because we cannot allow terrorists known to intelligence services pass through the holes in the net. And finally, we mustn't neglect the link between internal security and external security. An internal system for combating terrorism, however perfect it is, will never be effective if our neighborhood is not stable. A strong commitment of the EU in the management of conflicts in our neighborhood area is part and parcel of the anti-terrorist fight.
Merci et bonjour mes chers collègues. Je vais passer la parole.
Thank you and good afternoon. Mrs. Rodelin Bonfoy now has the floor for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Our thoughts go out today particularly to the victims of Brussels and elsewhere. These tragic attacks showed us how important it was to have closer cooperation, more Europe and more solidarity. The European security agenda is a major step towards creating a European space of internal security, and all stakeholders have to play their role to ensure that the EU pulls out all the stops to guarantee citizen security. The commitments entered into by Member States still have to be implemented in fact. The Parliament is very much involved in combating terrorism and is ensuring that the fragile balance between security and respect for freedom should be respected. They go hand in hand, and that's why for us the idea of setting up an inquiry committee into terrorism is not acceptable. We can't increase security at the expense of freedom. Jean Stoltenberg, the Prime Minister of Norway, in 2011, during the attacks on the Norwegian islands, said we are going to respond to terrorism with more freedom, tolerance.
Mrs. Tomasic has 1 minute.
Thank you very much. After the last terrorist attacks in Belgium, Germany and France, and a series of attacks that were prevented at the last minute by the intelligence forces and security forces, I think that the problem is much bigger than a pure manifestation of occasional individual madness. There are fanatic soldiers of the unrecognized criminal entity known as the Islamic State fighting against us on our own territory. So this war is being waged on our territory, and this means certain measures are necessary so that we can guarantee security for our citizens. This means that our security services, police and armies need to cooperate more intensively, exchange information, especially on the returnees from Middle Eastern conflict areas. Although some of them are citizens of the EU, they have chosen this path in a conscious manner, and we need to treat them as criminals that they are.
Thank you, Mr. Danjean, for 1 minute. I, of course, would like to join my voice to those paying tribute to the victims of Brussels, whose anniversary falls in a few days, and I welcome the actions undertaken by the European Commission in this field of internal security and anti-terrorism, where its powers are, of course, limited relative to those of the Member States. There are two other attacks which happened in March 2004 in Madrid, which remains the most murderous Islamic attack on European soil so far, and March 2012 in Montauban, where some French soldiers and Jewish children were killed. All of this marks the return of jihadist terrorism to Europe's soil, and every time this happens, the phenomenon was not expected and it was underestimated. So there's been a lot of talk today and in our last debate on this directive as well about specific anti-terrorism provisions. I'd like to stress strategic analysis and anticipation, because that's fundamental to understand how plastic terrorism is, where it's going to attack next and where it's going to reanimate networks that haven't been discovered so far.
Thank you very much. Mr. Piotrowski, also 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Most of the EU citizens think that the most important issue for all of us is the sense of safety and security, and that has been badly shaken after the terrorist attacks. The commissioner responsible for the security agenda said last year that the terrorists do not attack a particular member state, that they attack our lifestyle, our way of life. This is only half true, because the target of the attacks in Brussels was also the Belgian state. Its people are fighting terrorism. That's why the attack happened. And every country that tries to combat terrorism has to factor such a risk into account. We had the PNR regulation, and I have no problems with that. But apparently the Arms Directive is problematic because some people complain this is not about fighting terrorism, but about interests of others.
Okay. Mr. Salavanka. Thank you, President. Well, terrorism is a global phenomenon which tries to destroy our societies. And therefore the space of freedom and justice that we want to establish cannot be converted into a patent for letting terrorism reach. So 4,000 citizens of the European Union have belonged to terrorist organizations in countries like Syria and Iraq. And I think, Commissioner, that we have to take advantage of the fact that so many citizens in Europe want to see more involvement in the EU in fighting terrorism. Internally, that is to say, through the European Security Agency, and also looking for cooperation between member states and third countries, and avoiding that young people get radicalized over internet, and in the area of funding and money laundering, and in the area of prevention and control, Commissioner, of everything that has reference to anything that has to do with criminal transition. Now, the essential thing is the human factor, the human being. And let us recall the victims who want justice and want us to remember them.
Merci à vous tous pour.
Thank you for those statements. And I'll give the floor back to the Commissioner. And I say good afternoon to him.
Microphone, please. Please, microphone.
Chair, honourable members, thank you for this very rich debate. The last 2 years in particular have been marked by too many attacks and by too many victims. Our thoughts go to them and their loved ones. As Minister Borg said, last weekend we were with some of those victims, including some of the victims of the Brussels attacks. I was struck again, as I am each time I have the privilege of meeting victims, by their bravery, by the power of their testimony. But on this occasion I was also struck by the welcome that they gave to the just adopted counter-terrorism directive, and in particular to the elements, not least introduced by this House and reinforced by this House, on the rights of victims. They welcomed the fact that we were requiring Member States to make sure that victims have access to the support they need immediately after an attack, but also for as long as necessary thereafter. And I think that was an important piece of work that we did together. These attacks across Europe display a common factor. Many aspects of their preparation and execution are transnational. As a number of you have said, that's why it's so important that we work together to ensure the most appropriate response and increase our collective resilience. I'd like to salute the commitment that this House has shown on security dossiers over the recent discussions. It's crucial that we maintain this momentum and continue to work for their rapid and effective implementation. As many of you have said, we've done a lot, but there's still a lot to do. Many of you have mentioned the importance of information sharing. As we discussed in plenary last month, I believe we are moving in the right direction, with a clear increase by Member States in the use of the Schengen Information System and the Europol Information System. But there is still a long way to go. I hope that this House will move quickly now to support the proposals that we brought forward for the reform of the Schengen Information System, including, for the first time, a provision to oblige member states to share information on terrorism. Step by step, we need to continue our work to build trust. Improving information exchange is also at the heart of our work on interoperability that a number of you have mentioned. Overcoming the current shortcomings in information management is a key priority for the Commission. The process we initiated last year with a strategy presented in April and the high-level working group will allow us to address these shortcomings in an inclusive and transparent way with you here and with the Council. The group will present a final report in early May, and that will be a basis for further discussions with Parliament and the Council to look at how best to take this work forward. A number of you have also underlined the importance of operational police cooperation. The Commission has encouraged Member States to make use of the possibility to carry out police checks in internal border areas. At the same time, and in answer to one of your colleagues, we are considering practical steps to strengthen police cooperation across internal borders. Our objective is to enhance security within the Schengen area, including internal border areas, as part of the work that we're doing to use Schengen to get back to the normal functioning of Schengen. But we'll not defeat terrorism with databases and legal frameworks alone. We also need to continue our work, as many of you underlined, on implementation. We need to tackle radicalisation online and in our communities to prevent the hate mongers from inciting often young people to go down the route of violence. And we need to continue to build our collective resilience and to starve the terrorists and others who seek to do us harm of the means they use, whether that is arms, explosives, or funding. And as has been mentioned, while we're focusing on the threats related to terrorism today, quite properly, we should not lose sight of the continuing work that we're doing to reinforce our security against serious and organised crime and threats that come from cyber criminals and others who operate in cyberspace. In all of these challenges, there are no quick fixes. We need to continue to work to ensure the security of European citizens, recognising this is a long-term challenge requiring the engagement of all of us. For our part, the Commission will continue our efforts to build an effective and sustainable security union, and I sincerely hope that we can continue to count on your support in this work. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Mr. Borg, good afternoon. You have the floor for the Council.
Grazie, Madam Chair.
Thank you. This is the third time that I'm attending the plenary, but I think that this was the most important debate that I assisted to. It reminds us of the tragedy which happened a year ago. As many members of this House said, this tragedy aimed at the heart of the European Union. It was early in the morning, and when we received the news, we had an official from our perm rep who was there with his wife and his pregnant wife, actually, who was injured. I called him, I heard the crying, I heard the people in the airport. He was given help, his mobile phone was taken away, and we had no contact with him. The official who is sitting next to me today was almost at the airport to go on holiday. These people who survived and those people who passed away, we need to remember them, and we need to work to improve the security of our citizens. We should offer a safe continent in a peaceful atmosphere. This is what our citizens expect. This is a huge challenge. Some of the members, or rather the majority of the members, gave reactions to the declarations by the Commission and by the Council about the work which has been done during the last year. We need to prevent radicalization, and we need to have resilient societies. This all needs a long-term approach. I am convinced that with real will from the institutions and the member states, we can reach a sensitive balance. We need to offer security to our citizens, but at the same time, we need to keep our freedoms as listed in our treaties, and we need to keep to the rule of law. We need to use all the tools we have available, and we need to fight terrorism in an effective way by gathering information about terroristic networks, so we could stop them on time. We could stop the plans on time and address the threats immediately. I am convinced that through interoperable systems, we can have effective ways to contribute to the fight against terrorism. We can bring back the security which we aspire to. Thank you for this debate, because again I say this was one of the most interesting debates I attended to. There's an optimistic sentiment, and there's the will to work harder. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. That winds up the debate. And the agenda calls for the report of Mr. Winkler concerning supply chain due diligence by importers of minerals and metals originating in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. And we have a new commissioner. So I welcome Mrs. Malmström.